Hi, folks, and welcome to our next set of notes here in Global Issues. Today we're going to move on from geography and start to take a look at the United States. Now, in a class that focuses on global issues and focuses on taking a look at the rest of the world and what is going on, it's really important that we start by discussing the role of the United States in the world. It's really hard to have a discussion about the world and its issues and how those issues will be solved without first talking about the U.S. because most likely in some way, shape, or form we are going to be involved. The world as it is today has largely been formed thanks to the United States. A lot of good things and some bad things as you're going to come to find out. So we really want to start here at home, understand kind of the development of that role and what it means. So let's go ahead and get underway with that. And so we're going to be talking about something called Pax Americana. And before we get into that, I want to start with a simple question. Why do we, the United States, matter? What makes us important? So why does the rest of the world seem to care so much about us? Why do we seem to be involved in so many things around the world, not just problems here at home? What are the things that make the world seemingly revolve around us? Is it military power? Is it economic strength? Is it just our desire to be involved in things? So we want to think about that question, and we want to think of why has the world gotten to this point where it seems to revolve around us so much? So let's start looking at this term Pax Americana and ask, what is this? You probably haven't heard this term, so let's first define it. Pax Americana is Latin for American peace. And when we talk about Pax Americana, we are talking about the period from the end of World War II to today. So that's what we're referring to when we talk about Pax Americana. Now, before we talk about exactly what Pax Americana is, this term Pax isn't new. We've used this to describe periods in history before. So let's start by looking at some of the notable Paxes throughout history that we often have talked about. So the first major one the history often refers to is what's known as Pax Romana, which runs from about 27 BCE to 180 CE, or Common Era. And during this period, this is really an end to civil wars across the Roman Empire. There's relative stability within the empire itself. And thanks to that stability and lack of civil wars, there's this economic and cultural exchange across the Mediterranean. In other words, it allows trade to flourish because of this stability. Outside challenges to the empire were put down swiftly and violently during this time, and Rome would reach its largest and most powerful point, as you can see up in the top right-hand corner. So we can see at this point, this is when Rome literally spans the entirety of the Mediterranean. And so we see a lot of economic prosperity. We see people within the empire itself experience this period of tremendous safety and don't have to worry about violence from outside forces. The next Pax we'll talk about is Pax Mongolica, which is from about 1270 to 1360. And so this is the peace created by the Mongol Empire. And so during this time, again, we have an era of stability in Asia, brought about by the Mongol conquest. You can see on the right-hand side on this map, all the dark green is the extent of the Mongol Empire at its largest point. Through brute force, the Mongols kept trade routes open and safe, and this led to an economic, cultural, and scientific exchange across the continent of Europe. So this stability, again, similar to Rome, leads to an increase in economic exchange, an increase in interactivity throughout the continent and throughout the empire, and allows the empire to flourish economically as well as culturally and even scientifically. Lastly, we'll look at Pax Britannica, which ran from about 1815 to the start of World War I in 1914. This was an era in which the British Empire controlled nearly 1/4 of the entire planet. It was often said that the sun never set on the British Empire, and the reason for that was because the British Empire spanned so far and wide that depending where you were, no matter what time it was, somewhere in the world it was daytime within some part of the British Empire, whether that was in Canada or Australia or Southern Africa or in Britain itself. So it is this massive, wide-spreading empire. Through the level of control that Britain had, they were able to keep especially ocean trade routes open, leading to long-range trade all across the world, and an incredible amount of, again, economic prosperity. While, again, it's kind of weird to say, again, Pax Britannica would translate to British peace, this really wasn't a peaceful era. Very much Britain maintained its empire through pretty brutal measures. But we saw an avoidance of quote-unquote great power conflict during this era. When we say great power conflict, what we mean is superpowers did not really come to war with each other during this time. And so at this time we would think of superpowers as, Britain, France, Spain, what would eventually become Germany, but at this time would be more commonly known as Prussia, Russia, etc., etc. Now, obviously, that shatters in 1914 with the start of World War I, but again, for this 100-year period, we largely see an avoidance of conflicts between major superpowers. So in other words, you might notice a pattern here. We could describe any era that is denoted as a pax as an era of relative peace and stability with one world power at its center. So if you notice across all of these pieces, they are named after one central power or empire. Pax Britannica, the British Empire; Pax Romana, the Roman Empire; and today, Pax Americana, the United States. And so, in other words, there's one major power in which the world kind of revolves. Also, a pax is also denoted by stability and peace that leads to things like increased economic prosperity, that leads to increased cultural exchanges between countries. So that's really kind of the hallmarks of these paxes or pieces when we talk about these eras. And that's certainly the case, as you are going to see with the United States. So then let's talk about the Pax Americana. And let's start by talking about its origins and how the Pax Americana was formed. So, as we talked about, Pax Americana starts at the end of World War II. And so we hit 1945, we hit the surrender of Japan, and we reach a point where World War II is over. Following World War II, the United States finds itself as the only country that is able to say three things. And these three things are really, really key for why the United States would become the preeminent superpower within the world. Number one, they did not find themselves in economic ruin as a result of the war. In other words, unlike the rest of the world, which largely saw the war destroy their economies, the United States did not see that happen to them. In fact, the war ended up being an economic boon for the United States. So you can see here at the bottom, real output of the U.S. economy. And so this is the things built and sold within the economy itself. And so you can see from the 1870s to the 1930s, We see kind of a raising, steady raising of that line, and then a little bit of a dip when the Great Depression starts. But then all of a sudden, with World War II, this line starts to skyrocket. And we can see by the time it's 2005, this incredible increase in economic output by the U.S., which started in World War II. In other words, unlike other countries that largely saw the war destroy their economy and leave them economically crippled, we not only had to deal with that, our economy came out of the war stronger than it had been before. Now, that is largely tied into the second point. The second thing that we can say about the United States after World War II that many other countries couldn't say is the U.S. was not decimated as a result of the war. This meant that the U.S. didn't have to rebuild itself in the wake of the conflict. So number one, we can largely attribute to the fact that the other major powers within the war saw the country itself be a major battlefield at some point within the war. France obviously was conquered very quickly by the Germans and then would be a major battlefield as the Allies pushed back the Nazis. Germany itself would be a major battlefield for the entirety of the war, whether through bombing campaigns or the final push to Berlin. Britain was decimated by the Battle of Berlin and repeated bombings by the Germans. And then Japan, as we'll get into, obviously suffered from not just its own kind of decimation and kind of the fact that its resources couldn't keep up with its war efforts, but obviously the atomic bomb strikes as well. The United States, outside of Pearl Harbor, did not have any major battle or major destruction come to any of the country itself, any of its economic infrastructure, any of its major cities, none of that. So the U.S. didn't have to worry about having to rebuild itself. This also meant that it didn't have to worry about massive hits to its economy in the form of its economic sectors being bombed or attacked or taken over by other countries. But that's certainly not the case with every other major power in the world that was involved in this war. So England, we can see here London, as a result of the bombings that I mentioned, the city itself in absolute ruins. We can see Berlin, Germany here. We can see all these bombed out and destroyed buildings within the city of Berlin. We can see here in Normandy, the city in absolute ruin. And obviously we can see with Japan, Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the two cities that were decimated by the droppings of the atomic bomb, or atomic bombs, excuse me. So in other words, all of these countries found themselves absolutely ravaged by the war, but the United States did not. To go back to our previous unit, that largely has to do with geography. We had two oceans separating us from everyone else involved in the war. And third and finally, the U.S. military was largely intact following the war. Rather than leaving the war crippled, the U.S. military was unchallenged in its might and capability and its superiority. This is also largely due to how much the U.S. spent on their military during World War II in comparison to other countries. I'll get to that in 1 second. But the U.S. kind of really bought into this idea of what we often talk about as being total war. In other words, the entire society in some way, shape, or form taking part in the war effort. Whether that was soldiers fighting on the front lines or people back home, pouring into factories to help build munitions and weaponry and other resources needed to fight the war effort. And because of the strength of the U.S. economy in general, the U.S. was able to very, very quickly surpass the likes of Germany and Japan in terms of military might and size. We can see the realities of that economic difference on this chart. So if you look at this chart, this military spending, or what we often call defense spending, by country from the beginning of World War I through the end of World War II. And so you can notice from 1914, we see basically a rise in military spending along with most of these major countries. But for the most part, all of these military expenditures stay even. And then we hit World War II, and we start to see a rise from the United Kingdom, and obviously a big rise from Germany, and Japan, and France. But then we get to 1941, and we see the United States is just a straight line all the way up. And by the end of World War II, we are spending what in today's money would have been over $700 billion, where the next closest country that was even close to spending that much was Germany at just above $400 billion. So in other words, the U.S. military is massive compared to the rest of the world, and again, is not as decimated by the war as other countries. So those three things are incredibly important for setting the stage for a United States that is not licking its wounds after the war, but is actually in a perfect position to start asserting itself as the prime entity or superpower within the world. You can also see here is military spending from the end of from the end of World War I to the end of the Cold War. And again, you can just see that this military spending, while there is a drop following World War II when we start to get into the 1950s, it still is incredibly high compared to the rest of the world. The only power that really competes with the United States is obviously Russia, and then we see its military spending largely decline following the end of the Cold War. And this is still true today. The United States still spends vastly more on their military than the rest of the world does. So, we have those three things in mind. The United States then found itself at odds with the only other major world superpower that remained, and that was the USSR, or Russia. In an attempt to push back against the spread of communism, the United States helped construct a world order to unite Western countries with the U.S. at the head. Three notable decisions and institutions were created as a byproduct of this. So, following World War II, the United States is very well aware of who the next major problem is going to be. In fact, for the most part, the Allies understood during World War II that they were kind of dealing with the devil, that Stalin and the USSR was not, quote-unquote, one of the good guys, and that following World War II, the question would likely be, how are we going to deal with the rise of Russia and the increasing spread of communism? And so this very quickly, this conflict and this need to contain Russia materialized very quickly following World War II with the start of the Cold War. But with that said, the United States understood, again, any fight against Russia would have to involve the United States being at the head of that fight. So the U.S. went about around the end of World War II, creating certain structures and groups and alliances that would put the United States in this position as the head of a Western coalition or alliance to push back on Russia. So there are three notable decisions and institutions that we want to make note of when we talk about that. The first notable decision is the Truman Doctrine, which was issued by President Harry Truman. And basically it stated that the U.S. would provide support to all democratic nations under internal or external authoritarian threats. This meant that the U.S. would intervene in conflicts around the world even if they weren't directly involved. So in other words, the Truman Doctrine just stated that the U.S. will act to defend and uphold democracy anywhere in the world, even if they are not directly affected by that. Now, we should put a caveat on this, and in fact, you should put a big, big asterisk to this. Really what we should say here is the United States will intervene on the behalf of democracy when it aligns with our wants and goals. In other words, we were more than happy to align ourselves with dictatorships or overthrow democratic governments if they were governments that would end up aligning with socialism or communism or the USSR in general. This is especially true in Latin America, in the Middle East, and in Asia. It was not uncommon for us to go in and overthrow or orchestrate the overthrow of democratic governments or to support authoritarian rulers if it was in our interest to do so. So that's a relevant kind of asterisk to put on this because it is not as simple as we will protect democracy and uphold democracy wherever it is around the world. The second major thing is the creation of NATO and the United Nations. So let's talk about NATO first. So NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And it is a military alliance of Western nations with the core tenet that an attack on one country is an attack on all. So this was specifically focused on uniting the United States and Western European countries, specifically to create a unified alliance that would act as a warning to Russia. If Russia tried to invade one of those countries, it would trigger a response from all of the countries involved in NATO. So it acted as a deterrent against Russian aggression. In other words, it was meant to try and protect the West from the spread of communism and the spread of Russia. NATO still exists today, and we are still basically the main force within NATO. NATO still deals with Russian aggression, something we'll get into later within this course, but also deals with other issues. Those issues ranging from terrorism to natural disasters, as well as many other world problems. The next entity that we helped create was the United Nations. And so the United Nations is a diplomatic organization of 193 countries aimed at promoting diplomacy and peaceful dialogue in order to address world issues. So in other words, NATO is a military alliance. It is the military option there to act as a unified front to fight war when necessary. The United Nations is the diplomatic front, trying to unite countries and solve issues through diplomacy or discussion, trying to come to peaceful agreements to avoid conflict. And that's going to be important because we need to understand that this Pax Americana is largely based around creating military order, diplomatic order, and then our last point here, economic order. And that was done through something called the Bretton Woods Agreement. So the Bretton Woods Agreement is an economic agreement between the U.S., Canada, Western Europe, Japan, and Australia that set parameters on things like trade and currency exchange. It also created the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, or IMF, to help aid developing countries. Okay, so let me break that down so that makes sense. So this agreement between a multitude of countries did a couple things. Number one, it established rules with regards to currency exchange. So in other words, kind of how we determine, the one US dollar is worth X amount of British pounds or X amount of euros or whatever it may be. So that's the first thing that was established by this agreement. Secondly was established agreements on world trade. This included basic rules for how trade would be orchestrated between countries, and also included what currency would be used as the world currency. In other words, while we have that exchange rate now and we have an exchange system, it's kind of difficult to have the entire world trading in their own currencies. So we orchestrated that within the world's trade structure and atmosphere, we will use the US dollar as kind of the world trade currency. So that's the second thing. Third, we create these institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, which specifically are utilized to give loans and provide support to developing countries that need aid in some shape or form. So through these systems, the U.S. created a system of interdependence in which peaceful relationships are maintained among Western countries through military, diplomatic, and economic agreements. When we talk about interdependence, what we are referring to is we're creating a system where people are dependent on us, but we are also dependent upon them. And so we create a structure in which our peaceful relationship through military means, through diplomatic means, and through economic means ensures that the world order remains prosperous for those involved, at least those at the top. So the U.S. helps create this system, which basically creates a link between all the major countries in the world, links that are all military, diplomatic, and economic, and allows the U.S. to thrive within this system. So let's move on to talking a little bit about Pax Americana in the post-Cold War world. So after the fall of the USSR in 1989, questions arose as to whether the U.S. should still maintain its active role in the world. The decision of presidents like Bill Clinton and George W. Bush was yes. We can see that in Clinton taking an active role in addressing issues within Europe, with regards to the post-Cold War world, or intervening in conflicts in other places in the world. And we can see that with George W. Bush, when following 9/11, the U.S. gets very much entrenched in Afghanistan and Iraq, and becomes a very active participant within Middle Eastern politics and Middle Eastern conflicts. But why? Why, after the threat of Russia is dealt with, why do these two decide that we should stay involved? Well, for the U.S., there's a couple of reasons. Number one is economic. It is economically prosperous for us to maintain this system with us at the top. Because if we have control and we have the ability to make the key decisions and control how things work economically, especially with being the chief negotiator with regards to trade deals that we are affected by, that means we can ensure those things are profitable for us. The second thing is safety. In other words, if we are actively involved in the rest of the world, we can kind of continue to maintain this pax that has run since the end of World War II. Again, while we experienced the Cold War, very similar to Pax Britannica, from 1945 to now, there has been no major power war. And the number of people that have died within wars or conflicts has massively decreased in this time period. So safety is a big reason for wanting to maintain this role. And then lastly is power. If you create a world system where you are at the head, that means you get to shape the world in a way that is beneficial to you. And so by being involved with the rest of the world, by making sure that we are at the head still of organizations like NATO and the UN, and the World Trade Organization, which helps control trade, we are ensuring that we have power and that we have control over the decisions that are made over diplomatic, economic, and military decisions. Well, that's us. What about the rest of the world? Because this seems kind of weird. The U.S. is butting into other people's business. Why are they okay with this? So for what reasons does the rest of the world want the U.S. involved? Well, there's two. The first is economic. In other words, it's not just profitable for us, it's profitable for the rest of the world. If we are there to maintain peace, as I mentioned with previous Paxes, that keeps economic channels open, that allows for the free flow of trade. It's economically prosperous for other countries within this system. And lastly is safety as well. A lot of these countries, especially in Western Europe, are able to depend on the protection of the United States. This is especially relevant for small countries. In other words, if you are a small Eastern European country that maybe Russia has signaled, not just during the Cold War, but even today, a desire to annex or conquer that country, that very tiny country can rely on the U.S. having their back if they are part of NATO. And in that sense, they are protected from bigger outside threats. So we just addressed that first question. Why did those two presidents want to stay involved? But also in the wake of these two presidencies, how did the next two presidencies treat this world order? Obama and Trump. As you're going to see, to get kind of into what the future weeks will hold, these two will kind of focus on retracting us from this world order a little bit, especially the presidency of Donald Trump. We're going to talk about what that looks like and kind of some of the impacts that decision has had. All right, so from here, there are some response questions that you're going to want to do on Schoology. Part of that will be that box there at the end, at the bottom of your notes, advantages versus disadvantages of Pax Americana. You're probably going to want to fill that out first, put some bullet point thoughts in there, because that's going to help you with regards to the questions you'll have to answer on Schoology. If you have any questions or if anything's confusing here, please just let me know. But other than that, have a great day, and we'll see you next week.